The moment Kash Patel leaned forward and told Jamie Raskin that the Constitution was not a costume to be worn when convenient, but a restraint meant to be honored even when it hurts, the hearing room changed in a way cameras can sense before audiences do. It was not shouted, it was not theatrical, and that restraint made it sharper, because quiet accusations force listeners to lean in rather than tune out. You could see the ripples spread across the room as staffers paused mid-motion and reporters stopped typing, because everyone understood this was not going to be a polite exchange about abstract principles. Some viewers at home immediately asked why Patel would open with something that sounded so personal, so pointed, and so risky for a setting that pretends to value decorum. Here is the answer, placed right at the front, so you know how to watch what follows. Stay until the end of this video, because that opening strike explains every strategic move that comes next. I will be clear about my own perspective early, because pretending neutrality in a moment like this would itself be misleading. And audiences deserve intellectual honesty rather than performative balance. When two political figures collide this directly, the question is not who is morally pure, but who is shaping incentives and who is responding to them. Patel's opening line was not aimed at humiliating Raskin personally, but at collapsing the protective frame Raskin has spent years building around himself. That frame is familiar to anyone who follows Washington closely. The idea that expertise, academic credentials, and moral language automatically confer credibility. Patel's calculation was simple and brutal. If that frame could be cracked in the first 30 seconds, everything that followed would be interpreted differently by the audience. Raskin, for his part, came into the room with a different but equally calculated posture, one honed over years of televised hearings and cable news appearances. He understands that authority in modern politics is often performed rather than demonstrated, and that confidence, when delivered smoothly, can substitute for proof in the public imagination. His instinct was to claim the moral high ground immediately, to define any scrutiny as persecution, and to imply that his critics must therefore be enemies of democratic norms. That move is not accidental or even unusual. It is a rational response to an ecosystem that rewards moral clarity over procedural patience. If you can convince the audience that you are defending democracy itself, then anyone questioning you can be painted as suspect without addressing their substance. Patel knew this, which is why he refused to spar on moral language, and instead framed the conflict as one of process versus performance. By lowering his voice and slowing the pace, he forced Raskin's energy to look reactive rather than righteous, a subtle visual shift that matters enormously on camera. This is where viewers should pause and ask a controversial but necessary question that rarely gets asked honestly on YouTube. Are we watching accountability unfold, or are we watching two professionals compete to control the narrative? The answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is that it is always at least a little bit of both, because politics does not occur in a vacuum of pure intentions. In Washington, defining the story early is often more valuable than proving the story later, because first impressions harden faster than facts circulate. Raskin's opening rhetoric leaned heavily on identity, experience, and past service, all of which are real, but none of which automatically resolve present contradictions. Patel's opening rhetoric leaned on procedure and implication, which feels colder, but also signals to the audience that emotion will not be allowed to end the inquiry. That contrast is why the room felt tense even before any documents were introduced, because everyone sensed that the fight was not about what happened on one day, but about who gets to narrate history afterward. A small, almost humorous detail did not escape seasoned observers, as Raskin adjusted his glasses and smiled for the cameras, while Patel did not look at them at all. That difference matters because one posture is designed for viewers, while the other is designed to look indifferent to viewers. And indifference often reads as confidence. The public has been trained to distrust confidence when it is loud, but to trust it when it appears reluctant, even if that reluctance is itself a performance. This is not a moral judgment, so much as an observation about how audiences process authority after years of political spectacle. If you are wondering why Patel chose to open with accusation rather than evidence, the answer lies in the structure of modern hearings themselves. Evidence persuades slowly, but framing persuades instantly, and hearings are now consumed in clips measured in seconds rather than transcripts read in full. By the time evidence appears, most viewers have already decided who they trust, which is why the opening moments carry disproportionate weight. Raskin understood that dynamic just as well, which is why his initial response emphasized character and intent rather than procedural detail. In a different era, that might have been enough, but in a media environment saturated with moral claims, audiences have grown suspicious of anyone who sounds too certain too quickly. That suspicion is not ideological. It is experiential, born from years of watching confident declarations later walk themselves back quietly. So when Patel challenged the idea that constitutional language could excuse inconvenient facts, he was speaking to that accumulated skepticism, not just to Raskin. The uncomfortable truth for both sides is that the audience no longer grants trust automatically. But neither does it have the time or patience to verify everything independently. This creates a dangerous incentive structure, where the most compelling narrative often outruns the most accurate one, and where restraint can be mistaken for weakness. As this hearing moved forward, every gesture, pause, and tonal shift would be interpreted through that lens, whether fair or not. What followed was not simply a clash of records, but a clash of storytelling philosophies, one rooted in moral certainty, the other in prosecutorial implication. And if that sounds like an exaggeration, consider how many people watching at home were already choosing sides before a single document was fully explained. That is why this story matters beyond these two men, because it reveals how easily democratic processes can be transformed into narrative contests. If you want to understand what happens next, and why the escalation becomes inevitable rather than accidental, you have to keep that opening moment in mind. It was not just a line, it was a signal. And once that signal was sent, there was no path back to a neutral, technocratic discussion. From that point on, every word would either reinforce the frame or try unsuccessfully to escape it. Once the opening shock settled, the hearing slid into a slower, more dangerous phase, the part that never trends on social media, but ultimately decides how history remembers moments like this. The cameras were still rolling, the lights still hot, yet the energy shifted from spectacle to calculation, and both men adjusted in ways that revealed far more than their words. Kash Patel did not rush, and that restraint was itself a message, because in Washington, people who hurry usually do so out of fear that time will turn against them. He understood that silence, when used deliberately, can force an opponent to fill the void, and that every unscripted word spoken under pressure becomes a potential liability. Across the table, Jamie Raskin leaned into familiarity, speaking with the cadence of someone who has spent decades teaching rooms full of attentive students. That cadence is soothing, authoritative, and designed to reassure audiences that complexity is under control, even when it is not. At this stage, the conflict was no longer about a single allegation or document, but about credibility itself, about who the audience would believe when the details became messy. Raskin framed his responses as clarifications rather than defenses, a subtle rhetorical move that suggests misunderstanding rather than wrongdoing. It is an effective strategy in academic settings, where good faith is presumed, but politics is not a seminar room, and presumptions rarely survive sustained scrutiny. Patel, by contrast, avoided the temptation to rebut every line, because rebuttal implies equality of claims, and he was signaling that the claims themselves were not on equal footing. Instead, he treated Raskin's explanations as context, not conclusions, allowing them to exist without endorsement. This distinction matters because audiences often confuse uninterrupted speech with uncontested truth, a confusion Patel appeared determined to exploit carefully. Viewers at home began asking the kind of uncomfortable questions that rarely get voiced openly but shape opinion all the same. If someone truly believes they are on the right side of history, why do they seem so invested in controlling which facts are emphasized and which are dismissed as distractions? Is narrative discipline the same thing as intellectual honesty? Or does it become something else when stakes rise and reputations are on the line? These are not partisan questions, despite how quickly partisans try to claim them. They are structural questions about power and accountability. Raskin's defenders would argue that focus is necessary, that no investigation can include everything without collapsing under its own weight. That argument is not frivolous, and dismissing it outright would be dishonest, because all legal and political inquiries involve selection. The problem arises when selection consistently moves in only one direction, reinforcing a predetermined conclusion rather than testing it. Patel did not accuse Raskin of fabrication in this phase because fabrication is easier to deny than bias. Instead, he implied a more corrosive possibility that the process itself had been shaped by incentives that rewarded certainty over completeness. This is where the exchange grew heavier, because bias does not require malice, only alignment between personal interest and public narrative. Raskin's career, like many in Washington, has been built on moral clarity expressed with confidence, and that clarity has been rewarded with attention and influence. Patel's implicit question was whether those rewards had subtly altered the boundaries of acceptable doubt. The room felt tighter as this implication settled, because it did not rely on a smoking gun, but on a pattern of behavior familiar to anyone who has watched institutions defend themselves. There was a moment, almost darkly humorous, when Raskin joked about the length of investigations and the public's short attention span, drawing light laughter from the gallery. The joke landed, but it also revealed an awareness that attention itself has become a currency, one that shapes which stories survive and which fade quietly. Patel allowed the laughter to pass without comment, a decision that mattered more than a rebuttal, because responding would have validated the humor as harmless. By not responding, he let the joke hang awkwardly, reframed as a reminder of how easily serious issues are reduced to timing and optics. This is the point where many hearings lose viewers, because nuance does not clip well. And yet, this is where the real stakes reside. The exchange exposed a deeper tension between moral urgency and procedural integrity, two values often spoken together but rarely balanced comfortably. Raskin spoke as someone convinced that urgency justified compression, that the danger of delay outweighed the danger of error. Patel spoke as someone warning that compression, once normalized, becomes indistinguishable from manipulation. Neither position is cartoonishly evil, which is precisely why the confrontation felt unsettling rather than satisfying. Audiences are accustomed to clear villains and heroes, but what they were seeing instead was a clash between two rational strategies operating within a flawed system. This realization prompted another controversial question that viewers may not want to confront, but cannot avoid indefinitely. If our system rewards those who speak with absolute certainty and punishes those who admit doubt, are we incentivizing truth or are we incentivizing performance? Patel's measured tone suggested that he believed the latter, And that belief shaped every pause and pivot he made. Raskin's increasingly emphatic clarification suggested he believed certainty was a duty, not a risk. The collision of those beliefs produced friction that no amount of procedural language could smooth over. As this phase concluded, one thing became clear even to neutral observers. The hearing was no longer about adjudicating a past event, but about setting a precedent for how future events would be framed. That is why the exchange felt heavier with each passing minute, because precedents, once set, rarely remain confined to their original context. Whether viewers agreed with Patel or Raskin, they were being asked to consider what kind of political culture they were willing to normalize. A culture where urgency excuses omission, or a culture where process is protected even at the cost of momentum. The hearing did not answer that question yet, but it made clear that avoiding it was no longer an option. As the hearing pressed forward, the conflict entered its most revealing stage, the point where confidence begins to strain under the weight of accumulated implications rather than direct accusations. This was where surface-level rhetoric stopped being enough, and both men were forced to confront the long shadows cast by their previous choices. Kash Patel did not escalate his tone, because escalation would have allowed the moment to be reframed as personal animosity rather than institutional reckoning. Instead, he narrowed the scope of his questions, a tactic designed to make broad moral statements feel increasingly evasive by comparison. Across from him, Jamie Raskin maintained his composure, but small shifts betrayed the pressure. Longer pauses, more careful phrasing, and a visible effort to avoid absolute claims. These changes did not signal collapse, but they did signal recalibration, which attentive viewers recognize as the moment when a strategy begins to adapt defensively. At this stage, the audience was no longer being asked to decide who was right in principle, but who was consistent in practice. Consistency is less glamorous than conviction, yet it is far harder to fake over sustained scrutiny. Patel's line of questioning emphasized chronology rather than motive, because timelines expose contradictions without requiring intent to be proven. Raskin responded by contextualizing decisions within broader pressures, a move that resonates with anyone who has worked inside complex institutions. That response was reasonable, but it also highlighted a recurring tension, whether systemic pressure explains behavior or merely describes the environment in which responsibility still exists. Viewers began to sense that the disagreement was not about facts alone, but about standards, about how much deviation from ideal process is acceptable when stakes feel existential. This is where humor crept in again, almost inadvertently, when Raskin remarked that hindsight is always clearer than reality, prompting a few knowing smiles. The line worked because it was true, yet it also underscored Patel's underlying point that hindsight is only useful if one is willing to revisit earlier certainty honestly. Patel did not mock the remark, but he also did not let it soften the inquiry, allowing the moment to stand as a subtle acknowledgement rather than an excuse. The exchange revealed something audiences rarely see so plainly: how experienced figures navigate accountability without admitting error directly. Neither man was inexperienced, neither was naive, and that mutual awareness stripped the interaction of innocence while intensifying its seriousness. As this phase unfolded, the gallery grew quieter, not because interest waned, but because the implications were becoming harder to dismiss as partisan theater. People watching could sense that reputations built over decades were being weighed against procedural choices made under pressure. That realization leads to another uncomfortable question that many prefer not to ask aloud. If a system relies on individuals to self-police their certainty, what happens when certainty itself becomes a professional asset? Raskin's career, like many in public life, has been rewarded for clarity and moral framing, and that reward structure does not easily accommodate ambiguity. Patel's critique implicitly challenged that structure, suggesting that moral framing, when left unchecked, can crowd out inconvenient nuance. This is not an argument that morality should be excluded from politics, but that it should not be weaponized to preempt inquiry. The room felt heavier as that idea took hold, because it implicated not just one figure, but an entire mode of political communication. Several observers noted that Patel's calm persistence contrasted sharply with the expectation of explosive confrontation, a contrast that itself carried rhetorical force. Audiences conditioned by years of shouting matches were now confronted with something more unsettling, a methodical dismantling of assumptions rather than a dramatic takedown. Raskin, sensing the shift, emphasized intent again, reiterating that decisions were made in defense of democratic norms rather than personal gain. That emphasis mattered, yet it also raised the stakes, because once intent is claimed as virtuous, evidence to the contrary becomes more damaging if it emerges later. Patel did not contest intent directly, because intent is subjective and difficult to disprove without sliding into speculation. Instead, he returned repeatedly to outcomes, to what was done, what was omitted, and how those choices shaped public understanding. This approach resonated with viewers who have grown wary of explanations that rely too heavily on unseen motivations. The longer the exchange continued, the clearer it became that neither man could fully disengage without conceding ground. Each answer narrowed the field of acceptable follow-ups, tightening the logical space in which defenses could operate. The hearing, once framed as a procedural exercise, now felt like a referendum on how truth is curated in high-stakes political moments. That realization marked a turning point because it reframed the audience's role from passive observer to implicit judge. People watching were no longer evaluating personalities alone, evaluating the norms they wanted enforced going forward. This phase ended without a dramatic flourish, yet it left a deeper impression than any single accusation could have achieved. The sense that something structural was being exposed lingered in the room, unresolved but impossible to ignore. By the time the chairman moved the proceedings along, it was clear that the conflict had outgrown the individuals involved. What was now on trial was not just a set of decisions, but the broader culture that rewards certainty, punishes hesitation, and often treats process as an obstacle rather than a safeguard. And that is why the exchange felt increasingly consequential, because cultures, once normalized, are far harder to reform than any single career. By the time the hearing entered this phase, the dynamic had shifted from intellectual sparring to something more quietly destabilizing, because the audience could sense that neither side was fully in control anymore. What had begun as a contest over framing was now exposing the limits of framing itself, especially when repeated explanations started to sound less like clarification and more like containment. Kash Patel leaned into this moment without changing his volume or posture, which paradoxically made his presence feel heavier rather than restrained. He understood that when explanations multiply, credibility does not expand with them, it contracts, because each additional layer invites scrutiny of why it was needed in the first place. Across the table, Jamie Raskin began to emphasize institutional complexity with greater urgency, repeatedly reminding the room that large investigations are messy by nature. That reminder was accurate, but accuracy alone does not always persuade, especially when the public has grown accustomed to hearing complexity invoked selectively. At this stage, the exchange felt less like an argument and more like a stress test of public patience, a test of how much procedural explanation viewers were willing to accept before suspecting evasion. Patel's questions became narrower still, almost surgical, focusing on specific moments rather than overarching narratives. This tactic forced Raskin to move away from sweeping moral language and into more technical territory, where confidence is harder to perform convincingly. The shift was subtle, but it mattered, because technical explanations demand consistency, and inconsistency is far easier to spot than ideological disagreement. Raskin responded with careful language, qualifying statements that earlier in the hearing had been delivered with certainty. Those qualifications were not admissions, but they did signal an awareness that absolutism carries risk once timelines and decisions are scrutinized closely. Viewers who had initially tuned in for confrontation now found themselves watching something more uncomfortable, a slow narrowing of rhetorical escape routes. This discomfort is rarely satisfying in the moment, but it is often where accountability actually begins to take shape. A lightly sarcastic comment from Patel about how clarity tends to arrive only after headlines have done their work drew a brief, nervous chuckle from part of the gallery. The humor was understated, almost dry, and it landed precisely because it mirrored a shared cynicism about how narratives solidify before facts fully emerge. Raskin did not laugh, and that absence spoke volumes because humor can either diffuse tension or highlight isolation, depending on who shares it. The audience could feel the imbalance growing, not in terms of power, but in terms of momentum, which is often more decisive in public hearings than authority. As this phase progressed, the questions being raised grew more philosophical without becoming abstract. What obligations do investigators owe to uncertainty? And when does urgency become an excuse rather than a justification? Is it possible to defend democratic norms while simultaneously narrowing the range of acceptable doubt? Or does that paradox undermine the very norms being defended? These questions hovered over the room, unanswered but increasingly unavoidable, because both men were now speaking past the immediate exchange and toward future judgment. Patel's approach suggested that process itself is a democratic value, not merely a tool, and that eroding it in the name of urgency sets a precedent that rarely stays contained. Raskin's responses suggested that extraordinary moments demand extraordinary framing, and that hesitation can itself become a form of abdication. Neither position is absurd, which is precisely why the tension felt authentic rather than performative. The audience was being asked, implicitly, to choose which risk felt more dangerous: the risk of acting too decisively or the risk of acting too selectively. As the minutes passed, it became clear that this hearing would not produce a single clean takeaway suitable for a headline. Instead, it was generating a series of unresolved tensions that would linger long after the broadcast ended. Some viewers likely felt frustrated by the lack of a dramatic turning point, while others recognized that the absence of spectacle was itself revealing. When accountability becomes quiet rather than explosive, it often signals that the stakes are higher than any one soundbite can capture. By the end of this segment, the room felt heavier, not because a conclusion had been reached, but because the space for denial had narrowed. The exchange had not proven wrongdoing, nor had it exonerated anyone, but it had made clear that certainty, once claimed too early, is difficult to sustain under sustained inquiry. That realization alone marked a shift, because it reframed the debate from who was right to how rightness is established in the first place. And in a political culture addicted to immediacy, that reframing may have been the most disruptive act of all. If Part 4 narrowed the room, this phase quietly reoriented the audience, because the conflict was no longer about what happened, but about what it meant to insist on certainty before the record had finished speaking. The temperature in the hearing room did not rise, yet the pressure unmistakably did, the kind that builds not from shouting, but from accumulation. Kash Patel understood that this was the moment when many viewers, especially those watching online, would start asking themselves an uncomfortable question: they rarely articulate out loud. What if the issue was not whether one side lied, but whether one side decided too early that doubt itself was dangerous? That question does not lend itself to applause, which is precisely why it carries weight when raised in a public forum. Patel framed his next sequence of remarks around timing rather than intent, a move that subtly lowered the emotional temperature while increasing analytical scrutiny. He pointed out that in American political history, the most damaging failures often come not from malice, but from urgency paired with moral certainty. This was not a personal accusation, and he was careful to emphasize that distinction, because personal accusations trigger reflexive defenses that shut down listening. Instead, he treated the hearing like a case study, almost academic in tone, which paradoxically made it feel more threatening to those invested in a single narrative. Across the table, Jamie Raskin leaned further into the language of responsibility, arguing that leadership sometimes requires moving ahead of perfect information. That argument resonated with many viewers, especially those who believe decisiveness is itself a democratic virtue in moments of crisis. Yet the tension emerged when Raskin suggested that waiting for complete clarity can enable harm, because harm does not pause for investigators to finish deliberating. Patel did not dispute this premise outright, which would have been easy but unproductive. Instead, he asked whether acting under uncertainty requires greater transparency, not less, and whether narrowing access to contradictory evidence actually protects institutions or merely shields decisions from review. This was the point where the hearing began to feel less like a clash of personalities and more like a philosophical dispute about power. Who gets to decide when the record is complete, and what safeguards exist when that decision is made by people with political stakes in the outcome? The audience could sense that both men were now speaking to history rather than to each other, laying down arguments meant to be replayed long after the immediate controversy faded. A brief, almost self-aware moment of humor broke the tension when Patel remarked that Washington has a unique talent for declaring chapters closed while footnotes are still being written. The line drew a restrained laugh, not because it was sharp, but because it felt uncomfortably accurate to anyone who has followed politics for more than a single news cycle. Raskin responded with a half-smile that suggested he understood the critique, even if he rejected its implication. That exchange humanized the moment without trivializing it, reminding viewers that even deeply polarized actors sometimes recognize the same structural flaws from opposite sides. As the discussion continued, the focus shifted toward institutional incentives, a topic that rarely excites mass audiences but shapes outcomes more than ideology ever could. Patel questioned whether modern media ecosystems reward caution or certainty, and whether investigators can realistically operate outside those incentives once cameras are involved. Raskin countered that visibility can itself be a form of accountability, arguing that secrecy, even in the name of balance, can erode public trust just as surely as overreach. Neither argument was absurd, which is why the exchange felt unresolved rather than theatrical. This unresolved quality is precisely what unsettles audiences accustomed to clean moral conclusions, because ambiguity resists monetization and resists outrage. At this stage, viewers were likely divided not along partisan lines, but along tolerance thresholds for uncertainty. Some wanted firmer declarations, clearer villains, and faster closure. Others seemed increasingly wary of closure that arrives too neatly, especially when the process that produced it remains opaque. The hearing thus became a mirror rather than a verdict, reflecting how differently Americans understand accountability, depending on whether they prioritize outcomes or procedures. Patel's insistence on revisiting process suggested a belief that democratic legitimacy erodes quietly, through shortcuts justified by noble ends. Raskin's insistence on forward motion suggested a belief that democracy erodes when hesitation allows threats to metastasize. The clash between these views did not produce a winner, but it did produce a deeper question for the audience. Is democracy more fragile when it moves too fast, or when it moves too slowly? And who bears responsibility when either choice proves costly? By the end of this segment, it was clear that no amount of rhetorical skill could fully resolve that tension. What the hearing accomplished instead was something subtler and arguably more important. It forced viewers to confront the discomfort of not knowing which risk they fear more, the risk of decisive error or the risk of procedural paralysis. In a political culture that thrives on certainty, that discomfort may be the closest thing to honesty the process can offer. By the time the exchange reached its final movement, the room felt strangely quieter, not because the stakes had diminished, but because the audience understood that nothing decisive was going to arrive wrapped in a clean, rhetorical bow. This was no longer a confrontation designed to generate viral clips, but a reckoning about how power justifies itself once the cameras stop pretending to be neutral observers. Both Kash Patel and Jamie Raskin appeared aware that whatever followed would be remembered less for what was said than for what it revealed about their underlying assumptions. The audience, particularly those watching online, leaned into that realization, sensing that this was the moment where subtext mattered more than sound bites. It was here that the argument quietly transformed from a dispute about facts into a dispute about trust. Patel closed his line of questioning not with an accusation, but with an observation about institutional memory, noting that history rarely forgives those who confuse urgency with infallibility. He argued that democracies do not collapse from a single dramatic act, but from a series of small, well-intentioned decisions that slowly narrow who is allowed to question power. In his framing, the real danger was not that leaders act under pressure, but that they later refuse to revisit those actions once the pressure subsides. That refusal, he suggested, is how temporary measures calcify into permanent norms, long after the original justification has faded. The implication was clear, even without being stated outright, that accountability delayed is not the same as accountability denied, but it often feels identical to those on the receiving end. Raskin's response was reflective rather than defiant, and noticeably less performative than his earlier remarks, as if he recognized that tone itself had become part of the evidence. He spoke about the burden of leadership during moments when delay feels like abdication, and how officials are often judged not by the fairness of their process, but by the clarity of their resolve. He acknowledged that certainty can be dangerous, yet warned that endless skepticism can become its own form of irresponsibility, especially when threats are perceived as immediate. The tension between those positions lingered unresolved, because neither man was arguing in bad faith, and that unsettled viewers accustomed to moral binaries. This was not a clash between truth and lies, but between competing theories of risk management in democratic systems. At one point, a question floated implicitly through the room, the kind audiences often whisper to themselves, but rarely hear spoken aloud. If both sides believe they are protecting democracy, how does the public determine when protection becomes overreach? And perhaps more uncomfortably, who gets to make that determination when the institutions tasked with oversight are themselves politically invested? A brief moment of irony cut through the gravity when Patel remarked that Washington is remarkably skilled at declaring lessons learned without ever agreeing on what the lesson was. The comment drew a muted laugh, not because it was particularly sharp, but because it described a familiar cycle many viewers had grown tired of watching repeat. Raskin nodded slightly, an acknowledgement that sounded less like agreement and more like recognition, the kind that comes from living inside a system long enough to see its patterns. That moment did not resolve the argument, but it underscored a shared awareness that the system rewards certainty far more consistently than humility. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion, the absence of a dramatic crescendo became its most striking feature. There was no final verbal knockout, no line destined to dominate headlines for weeks, and no clear moral victor emerging from the exchange. Instead, the lasting impression was one of unresolved complexity, which for some viewers felt unsatisfying, and for others felt refreshingly honest. The audience was left to sit with competing fears, fear of unchecked authority on one hand, and fear of paralyzing doubt on the other. Those fears do not cancel each other out, and the hearing offered no illusion that they ever will. What it did offer was a rare moment where political theater gave way, however briefly, to institutional self-examination in full public view. In the end, the most consequential question was not who scored more points, but whether viewers were willing to tolerate uncertainty in a culture addicted to conviction. Democracy, as the exchange quietly demonstrated, is not threatened only by those who act in bad faith, but also by those who refuse to acknowledge the limits of their own certainty. That realization does not fit neatly into a partisan frame, which may be why it resonates long after the room empties. As the cameras powered down and staffers began collecting papers, there was no sense of closure, only the recognition that the argument would continue elsewhere, in media, in classrooms, and in private conversations. For those watching closely, that lack of closure may have been the most honest outcome possible, not because the truth was unknowable, but because democratic accountability is not a single moment, and anyone who promises it can be delivered that way is already simplifying a system that survives only through sustained discomfort.